This is episode 60 of the Effective Executive podcast and YouTube channel. And in episode 59, I walked through experience I had with T-Mobile slash Sprint, and some problems that I had in working with their company. It had to do with my wife's return of her phone and also getting a credit or getting off the lease for my son's phone, which I got some relief on. But regardless, this episode, I want to talk about some of the things that I learned as a consumer that I've seen in working with telecoms that I think consumers can probably learn from. The first takeaway is some states allow recordings that are one-party consent. Now, I'm not an attorney. I don't play one on TV, all of that. But typically, you can record a phone call, especially, most corporations and contact centers are recording your phone calls and say so at the beginning. And they're required to for many of the states in the United States. But as far as the consumer goes, you may have some leeway there. I'll put a link below. But again, even the link I don't think should provide legal advice. But you might want to check with your state what the action is. But in Indiana, one-party consent is just so it's kind of goes back to the Patriot Act. They don't want people in Indiana, at least, are protected from the government from listening to phone calls, and there's a whole thing about that, obviously, that's been going on for a while. But one-party consent is what's required to do a recording. So I often record my phone calls. The second thing is, and I know a lot of telecoms do this. I've seen it over the years with different telecoms that I've worked with, both in the States and also overseas, is they want to negotiate. If you have multiple issues, they want to close out each issue one at a time. In other words, you agreed, to this relief or this conclusion on the first thing. So that's done. I've got it on recording. So, it's done. We've negotiated that. So just be aware if you have multiple issues that you're going to want to negotiate the whole thing. Because I was looking for a lot of things, credits for past statements and things of that sort. And what they wanted to do was kind of separate that out. It was kind of divide and conquer type of an approach. And like I said, it's not just telecoms. Companies do this. They think this is a good negotiating thing. The other thing is, I mentioned in the previous episode that I, spent close to 2 hours on the phone with T-Mobile and / Sprint. I'm not even sure they have a different website still, Sprint. So it's confusing to me. But regardless, I spent almost 2 hours with them just because I wanted to see what would happen. I wanted to see how they handled things during the course of the phone call. Normally, I would escalate pretty much from the beginning. If I spent 15 minutes on the phone, and you're probably spending longer with some of the hold times, which you're familiar with, which I didn't mention in episode 59. I did, the end-to-end time, including the hold time, was absorbently long, well over 2 hours. But you wait, right, in order, and that's part of the time. That's the experience, right? Everybody's talking about customer experience. This experience basically was crap. But by the time you reach somebody, you're already, your blood's boiling a little bit because you've had to wait so long. But the first thing to do is escalate. If you're not getting anywhere with somebody and they're playing games with you about damage to phones, like if you listen to episode 59, I talk about, escalate immediately. And don't be afraid to escalate beyond the supervisor. Most likely, once you get to a middle manager and I've gone to executives before too, you're going to wind up getting more than you're going to get from somebody that is customer facing. And these are some of the lessons that we'll talk about with regards to executives here in a minute. But the other thing is post on Google reviews, or if there's some way to review their organization, post it. If you have a blog about it. Even if this isn't the subject, letting people know that this is unacceptable and how you were treated, and explaining in the more detail, the better. That this is one way that you can get change. Now, some of these large corporations are harder to change. Some of them are insensitive, which leads us to the conversation about executives. An executive looking at the situation of what happened with between me and the agent Gerald and the supervisor Paul would not. They don't hear those conversations. What they see is the data. Well, we had this phone call, could have cost us, $1,000 or $2,000, but look what we did. It's kind of like, see how we put out the fire, and it didn't need to happen that way in the first place. The information was on the survey that somebody could have contacted me with. So that's another thing executives can take away, is the aggravation of having filled out a survey, told them about what the problems were that were causing my score or of 2 out of 10 on a survey, and hearing nothing. And I can tell you, even though I was sent another survey from Gerald or Paul, or I'm not sure who pulls the trigger on that, but send me another survey, which I know is completely useless, just makes no sense to me. And who knows? Maybe those guys were having fun, but it wasn't fun for me. And I think that's the bottom line. That's why I'm spending 2 episodes going through this madness that executives at T-Mobile and Sprint should know about, and their customers should know about also. So, I have a whole thing on surveys on episode 44. Stop doing surveys. Paul and Gerald both know I was unhappy with the service I was receiving. Sending me a survey just aggravates the customer more. If you want to, you can listen to that particular episode, and I go walk you through how to do surveys correctly. But just sending a survey out after every call makes little sense, because, like I said, T-Mobile and Sprint both know that they don't need to survey me to know that I was unhappy with the service that I was giving. The other takeaway for executives is, did they save money? Oh, look how great a negotiation job we did, but I don't have any desire to be with these guys. I'm complaining here. I didn't put anything Google reviews. 2 episodes should probably do it, I would think, as far as my dissatisfaction. And, are they saving money in this negotiation process that they're going on? They probably could have found something that I'd be agreeable to. I've had companies kind of, as I've escalated, like I said, when you reach an executive or you complain enough on social media, sometimes you'll get more than what you ask for. I'm not asking for more than what would be fair compensation for problems that they created. And I think most consumers are that way because they don't really feel like spending 2 hours on the phone going through the problems and the issues that they had. But definitely the frontline people are not in any way able to make a decision about anything. It had to be escalated to the supervisor, and I'm sure he had, as most organizations have, a certain dollar amount that he's allowed to give away before he has to escalate to somebody else. But that's why I say, if you're a consumer, just escalate as fast as you can. But anyway, are you saving money? Did they save money? And the saying I use is a focus on costs, on cutting costs, increases costs every time. Because now they're going to have to overcome this particular episode and, a poor customer rating and someone who speaks on these subjects to audiences on a regular basis. This is not a good thing. You're off to spend more on marketing, I guess, but most executives aren't aware of some of the interactions, and that's why executives, one of the takeaways too, is they need to go and listen to the calls. They need to understand what's happening, or even better, it's listening to calls. You aren't going to get the same behavior. Most of your organizations out there, large ones that I work with, record the calls, and so spend time listening to recorded calls so that you can get a sense of what's going on. And you can also typically, sometimes it takes a little work, but listen to all the calls, all the contacts the customer had. Oh, we sent this guy a survey. Yeah, he did respond back. Well, did anybody contact him? No. Why not? Because that isn't what we do. And I have no idea, again, with Sprint, T-Mobile, if how their system is set up, other than we got a 2, so I guess we don't do anything. It doesn't make any sense to me. And it shouldn't make any sense to you as an executive. They will lose a customer at some point because it was such an aggravation. Hopefully I'll convince 50 other people or 100 other people, or maybe they don't even have to be convinced because they're getting crappy customer service from this particular organization. So that's really, those are the major takeaways for executives. Is you got to know what's going on in your organization. You got to understand what is the impact of some of these policies, because every executive that I've ever worked with has at least some bend towards, boy, I got to cut costs. I got to cut costs. I got to cut costs. Not looking at the whole and the impact on what happens with the consumer when they're not satisfied. So that's my message for episode 60, and I will catch you next week.